Massachusetts, with black kids and white kids, you know, and if you go through the book, you discover that, my heavens to Murgatroyd, there are black teachers in white schoolrooms, there are Catholics, there are Protestants, there are Jews, there's all kinds of people. I even have a picture of kids, you know, talking about Buddhism. And this was 1944, you know, before I even made it to grade school. And what's really interesting about this picture, it says, every people in the world have many good points. We must try to understand them. That's what's on the blackboard. And here is a picture of Lenin. And here is a picture of Stalin. And they're talking about famous people, and they're talking about Soviet buildings and Soviet art. Now, 1944, you go out and you quiz most college graduates today and ask them, who was allied with the United States in World War II? And many of them will not know it was the Soviet Union. They'll think it was Germany. I mean, what happened is very simple. World War II, there was a momentary window of reciprocal hospitality between the Soviets and the Americans, out of necessity, because they were fighting the Axis powers. And in order to go back to the anti-communist hysteria that had existed in the United States prior to the alliance of World War II, going back not merely to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1918, it went clear back to 1835 and before, because the predecessor of the commie perverts were the Jacobins of the French Revolution. If you want to know how counter-revolutionary the United States is, go back and study people like Tom Paine, who the American ambassador to France tried to get guillotined. And in fact, the only reason Tom Paine was not guillotined in the terror in Paris is because the Luxembourg, which was the prison he was in, they were a little laxer in you know, their prison system then. And since there was no air conditioning and it was, you know, summer and it was hot, the executioner put an X on his door to be taken to the guillotine, and he had opened the door, and so the X didn't show. So they missed him on the way through because they didn't see the X on the door, because the door was against the wall. And it was the U.S. ambassador who was trying to ensure that Paine would be guillotined so he wouldn't come back to the United States and cause heartburn for the industrialist bankers and other scumballs that had staged the counter-revolution of 1789. You don't get this in your history books. The thing is that after the French Revolution, it's like somebody pointed out the other day, on the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, you could get, you know, 50 different programs on the Scarlet Pimpernel, who was the wonderful French nobleman who rescued other nobility from the evil proletariat, you know, lopping off the heads of the other aristocrats. And so what happened was, we had George Washington in alliance with George III of England and all the crown heads of Europe, fighting against and opposing the French Revolution. And that didn't change up to the minute we are presently talking right now. The history of the Second Republic has been absolutely counter-revolutionary since its very founding. The U.S. ambassador, in fact, tried diligently to ensure that Paine would not survive, and only with the coming to power of Thomas Jefferson was Paine rescued from his situation and, in fact, returned to the United States. But then, if you go to the history of American labor, you discover that the shoemaker strike in Boston in 1835, the local big shots, bankers and Chamber of Commerce types, were denouncing the shoemakers as being red Jacobins. Well, the label red actually came from the French Revolution. Well, of course, then you have this whole revolutionary history in Europe, which includes the Communist Manifesto of 1848, where they said, oh, call me a revolutionary, thank you very much, I'm proud of it. Instead of going, I'm not either, I'm just kind of liberal, actually. You know, it's like, you know, somebody accused Bubba of being a lefty. In fact, it was the Newt who called him a left-wing counterculture McGovernnick, which is kind of amusing since the McGovern was in fact a World War II combat bomber pilot who flew something like 30 missions, and in fact was a lawyer, and in fact was just about as close to straight arrow as you can get. You know, and calling him I mean, it's just bizarre. But those who don't know history get rolled over by it. So Bubba denied that he was a counterculture McGovernnick, whatever the hell that means. And, you know, we keep going on, and we had that little window of, my God, we're in alliance with the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat. Now, how can we switch it when the war is over? Well, what we did is very simple. We had spent the entire period getting ready for World War II quite surreptitiously and illegally. In fact, it's fun to go back and listen to some of the radio programming of the late 30s, because in fact you will find that programs like, oh, The Shadow feature mad Germanic bombers in New York. I mean, these guys are just absolute, total, complete, despicable, vile krauts who have an absolute psychotic lust to blow people up. You know, and this is 1937 we're talking about. Well, that's how you prepare people to become imperial hockey pucks. You program them. You know, please remember, Saddam Hussein was worse than Hitler. Didn't the Twisted Shrub tell us that? You know, he tried all kinds of, you know, gambits. And then he said, oh, well, it's really for jobs. And then he said, well, no, it's for oil. And finally he said, it's to prevent this demonic character from getting his hands on nuclear weapons. And the button finally connected, and the American people went, oh, in that case, go kill them. You know, I mean, people get programmed like this, and you watch it, and it's like, you know, watching a, you know, a puppy, you know, chasing its own tail. I mean, it's that crude, it's that bizarre, and it works every goddamn time. There's no learning curve, folks. You know what they call people with zero brain function?
Dead.
No, organ donors.
Oh.
Organ donors. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, hell, you might as well use them as organ donors because obviously there's no brain function. I mean, I get so outraged over this because it's so obvious, it's so transparent. If you can just step back and watch the way they set you up and manipulate you. I mean, the contract on America, which was only signed by one party, please note, the other party is not required to sign in a contract on the hockey pucks. Every word in every one of those provisions was tested on focus groups. You think that that was not run through the same mechanism that they invent advertising with? I mean, they get a representative sample of people and they run the program across and they ask people, well, how did you react? Do you feel good? Do you feel bad? Does that make you feel warm and fuzzy? You know, or does it make you this or make you that? And they change the little stimulus box so that they can fine-tune it. And it is supposed to get you know, through and trigger the right emotional response independent of any intellectual function. That's how they do it. And you're supposed to be enough mental function to say, no guys, no, 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 go take a hike. Not going to buy any of this crap. Let's talk about reality. Like, I don't want to know if the economy's doing well. I want to know how the people are doing. You know, I want to know why they cut the minimum wage from $8 an hour to $4.25. I want to know why we have more homeless children today than we had a decade ago.
Because it's a free country and that's where they want to live. You know that.
You know, that's probably a better answer than Newt would have come up with. Because it's more honest.
I have people telling me that all the time. Telling me I don't understand those people. I don't understand why they want
They love living under the bridge. It was a matter of choice. I decided this morning when I got up that I was not going to go out and invest $1 million in Mexican bonds. And it was a matter of choice. If I would have wanted to, I could have. Do you realize that there are absolute lunatics called economists like Milton Friedman who actually had an article a few years back about what to do with that spare $10,000 you got, you know, rattling around in the drawer. You know, you could either, you know, buy a T-bill or you could buy a diamond. And that he recommended that you might want to buy the diamond because you get more existential satisfaction out of the possession of the diamond, even though it had in fact no interest-bearing value, than the value of the interest you'd get from buying the T-bill. And this is Milton Friedman. Marie Antoinette is a prototype. I mean, she was not being a smartass. When she was advised the people of Paris were hungry, because, you know, in her kitchen, the cooks, you know, would either be baking bread or doing pastries. And if there was no bread, that meant that the cooks were making pastries. So when she said, well, let them eat cake, she didn't mean it the way it was taken. She thought that people had a choice. And the only problem was not that there was no bread and no cake, but that it was either you had bread or you had cake, because obviously they were busy doing the other. So that, you know, statement of hers was you know, made with total, complete naivete. She wasn't being a smartass. But the people of Paris just took it all wrong. And in fact, she and King Louis the Last would not have lost their heads if they had just basically taken the deal they were offered. They were sent out of Paris and told, don't muck with politics. Give it up. You know, you'll have a retirement. I mean, it's like Newt, you know, is now got a $60,000 a year retirement for life guaranteed, even if he quits tomorrow. And he's whining about not having enough money. He's only getting $171,750 per annum and $25,000 a year expense account. I personally live on less than his expense account annually, and I don't even bother to whine about it. But that's why he had to have that $4.5 million book deal from somebody who, in fact, is going to make billions if Nudie Boy can make the right deals. I mean, this is a level of cynicism, corruption, and stupidity that is over the edge. And I'm just hoping that eventually these totally naive Marie Antoinettes in the court of King Bubba the Last screw up big time. Because I'm not absolutely opposed to capital punishment under special circumstances. And if there is a revolution, I went through one in Nicaragua, and I told them, I said, any Guardia Nacional that you catch, you off. And they said, no, we can't do that. They abolished capital punishment, put in a 30-year maximum sentence no matter what your crime was. And like, you know, good Christians that they all were, you know, suffered the consequences. I'm not that Christian. You know, as far as I'm concerned, let's face it, I mean, there were an awful lot of Tories and an awful lot of loyalists who got a major, major problem after the American Revolution. If they weren't, in fact, lynched, they exited stage left. In fact, one reason Canada is so screwed up with so damn many Tories is because 250,000 U.S. Tories went to Canada. In fact, a higher percentage of the U.S. population at the end of the, and during and at the end of the American Revolution fled the United States than fled Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. You don't get that in your history books either. And the thing is, of course, that totally screwed up Canada. It's like, you know, what's going on in Ireland, where you got a whole bunch of loyalist pigs, you know, that were imported into Ireland by the British government, you know, were actually Scotsmen, who basically got beached in Ireland, and they're scared to, you know, to even think about the possibility of having to be Irish. They're not Irish, they're British, thank you very much. And that's where all kinds of problems come from. But our problem is we have never really finished the American Revolution. Because there was a counter-revolution in 1789, and we have been living under a counter-revolutionary system ever since. And we may want someday to finish the American Revolution, which is going to be real hard on Tory fascist pigs. You know, anybody who ever had a nice word to say about Margaret Thatcher is going to be on the short list. Anybody who ever thought Ronald Reagan was anything other than Bonzo's co-star is in some trouble. Anybody who thinks that Bubba is a Democrat is obviously going to have to go in for psychiatric counseling. And what I find really bizarre is there are some women journalists, either, you know, at KBOO or out of Texas, who apparently, every time they think about Bubba, they get a little bit bizarre, and they keep saying, he is a Democrat. He's different than Bush. Well, he's different than Bush. He got NAFTA through, he got the crime bill through, and he got GATT through. Bush couldn't have done any of those things, because by now his sucker would have been impeached.
Have the same intellectual relationship to history and politics as the garden slug does in my shiitake log patch to the big son of a bitch with a knife that's going to bisect them. They never see me. I go out there and there's this slug going after that shiitake, and I, you know, there are another 2 half slugs, and they never see me coming. Well, most people have the same relationship to real politics that the garden slug does to the turkey with the knife. They never, ever notice. And we had, you know, a few people drop in the Persian Gulf on our side, and then we hear how they did this so that we could all go out and protest, that they did it for our freedom of speech. In fact, the OCA is pushing that particular thesis with great enthusiasm, saying that, lo and behold, if it weren't for all these warriors going out and killing people who didn't have a goddamn chance, that we wouldn't have freedom of speech. Has anybody ever bothered to stop quacking long enough to notice that every war under the Second Republic has resulted invariably in the reduction of freedom of speech? Every war since George Washington has resulted in the suppression of freedom of speech, and virtually all of the Bill of Rights, every time. And in the period of the 20th century, every war has been the pretext upon which there has been an escalation in the state apparatus, not merely to suppress freedom of speech at the moment, but to continue that suppression at an augmented and escalated level. So that every time we have a war, we have less freedom of speech, less civil rights, less support for the Bill of Rights, and I would like to know why everybody quacks the big lie. Nobody ever went and fought a war for the Second Republic in order to preserve the right of citizens of the United States to voice their opposition to government policy. And anybody who believes that has just had a frontal lobotomy. Because every war results in the reduction of the Bill of Rights as an operating tenet of this society. And that in fact due process has been trashed, not merely in this century, go back to the Civil War. Lincoln did hellacious damage to the Bill of Rights and to due process in prosecuting that war. You know, on the 4th of July, when the what is the neo-fascist group that's now trying to the Oregon Citizens Alliance, the OCA?
The name of that parade is like the Liberty Parade, or the fight for your.
How about Truth and Justice Parade? Why don't we beat them with a punch?
Yeah.
Whose liberty are they talking about?
First Amendment parade.
Are they still going to roll tanks through the thing?
They weren't gonna, it wasn't gonna
Well, they were talking about it in Oregon, you know, because they had a thing where they were roll tanks. Seriously, they're roll tanks right through downtown.
Well, they've done it before.
They brought some-
They've done it before in Rose festivals and 4th of Julys and whatnot. But this is an important point. Are people conscious of the effect on the Bill of Rights every time there's been a war? I mean, is this something that you're conscious of, not just sort of you know it intuitively, but I mean, is this a real piece of information so that when you hear these brain-dead ambulatory organ donors talking about how all these people went off and bled and died for our right to protest, you can say to them, quack, quack, quack. I mean, are people really conscious of that? Because this is the historical record. How many people here really believe that the majority of the population of the United States is so wonderfully happy with the way things are that there isn't a chance that anybody would actually do anything violent against the established order?
That's what the gun laws are being pushed right now. I think
I mean, they want to get the frogs unarmed before they go back and boil them some more.
Yeah, exactly.
You noticed! That's what it's all about. You do not want to get the frogs too hot until you
jump out
sufficiently disarmed.
Yeah. That's why I think there's something, an unplanned portion here.
I think things get dicey. I think that's what the whole situation is. And I think that's why there's going to be a coup. It's precisely because if you let the situation go too far, the control gets too raggedy. And the elite, if you'll notice, the mob families fight with each other, but not when they put the mob system at risk do they fight with each other. They immediately work together to protect the system.
You think the Democrats will be all over this, and they're not.
Well, that's exactly the point. If, in fact, Dukakis had used the material that was furnished to him by the Christic Institute, by myself, and probably others I don't know
Barbara
about.
Honecker, too, she said she went to him.
Well, okay, add that in. I mean, I personally had a prima facie case of Bush's having lied about his relationship with Noriega. Absolute, irrefutable, documentary evidence of his lies about his relationship with Noriega. I provided the whole packet, not only to Dukakis as campaign director for Oregon, but also to Jesse Jackson's. Jesse Jackson did not use it any more than Dukakis did. Because, if you'll note, one of his kids was a member of the National Democratic Party Central Committee. His kids are going to elite universities. His whole family has been moved out of a position of caste into a position of class. And there's a curvilinear relationship between race and class in the United States, as well as gender and class. When people get into the elite. It doesn't make any difference what color they are or what their gender is. Their primary loyalty is to the class. And you get down to the bottom, then these divisions on all these other grounds hold. Because on the bottom, everybody's competing for limited resources, which are in fact limited precisely because the people who run the system keep it limited, so you will fight over it. In Auschwitz, they had it down to an absolute science. They had 9 wheelbarrows, or excuse me, 9 workers and 8 wheelbarrows. And instead of the 9 people ganging up on the Gestapo guard and saying, you know, stuff your wheelbarrow, they would, the last 2 people, fight over the last wheelbarrow. Well, how is it really different? The amount of production that this system will develop now with all this wonderful high tech, they talk about a problem of overproduction. We can produce more than can be consumed. Well, but part of that reason is, of course, that people are not permitted to get what is produced because they're not part of the system of production. Well, when do we get the 40-hour week? When did we get the 40-hour work week in this country? I mean, you somebody!
48, 49?
Oh, you're off.
1898, 1896.
Really?
Yeah. That was the labor war a century ago, was over the 8-hour day. Well, golly, we got the 8-hour day, we got the 40-hour week, and we had a technology level where everybody could get a job, because there were handles enough for everybody. We imported millions of people. Send us your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be exploited.
How many people remember that's what May Day's about? That's a historical black hole thing.
You got it. It was invented in Chicago.
Haymarket Square.
May Day, the International Workers' Day, was invented in Chicago. You know how those damn foreigners are.
Armand Hammer's father, as a matter of fact, is involved with that, wasn't he?
Very possible.
And George Schultz's father, they were buddies.
That I don't know.
Yeah, they were old partners.
But the thing is, in that era, with that technology, we had a production system that required all these people to work 40 hours a week. Now, everybody, I'm sure, is up to speed with, oh, we got wonderful technology here, you know, this wonderful whiz-bang camera that used to take, you know, 2 people to pack a 16mm camera around, you know, and then you had all kinds of people who had to take the film, you know, and develop it. And I mean, there was a massive amount of labor that went into doing the same thing. It can be now done in a totally new technology, much less in the way of people. Why do we still have this immortal 40-hour week? I mean, why don't we have a 20-hour week?
It doesn't leave you any time for thinking and reading and doing things that are important to you.
Well, if you are working a 40-hour week, you're very likely actually working more like 58 because you're doing overtime, because they don't want to spread the jobs around. They'd rather see if you can drop in harness. So if you are working, you're working so goddamn much that you can't, you know, really step back and look at the world and think about it for 2 milliseconds because you're so damn wore out. You know, and the thing is that, on the other hand, if you aren't working, you can be picking up cans, you know, out of dumpsters, or you can be doing any number of very strenuous and more or less creative things, selling drugs or whatever, and you still don't have any time to think about anything, so you're so goddamn busy doing what you have to do just to stay alive. They've got you coming and going. And of course, if you get into the top 20%, the last 10 years have been great for them because now they in fact get as much income as the entire bottom 80%. Well, why is it that we're all living in this world where the 40-hour week is
Did Moses come down with a stone tablet or something? And I mean, is it God that gave us the 40-hour week? I mean, originally, the only way we even got a 40-hour week and an 8-hour day was because people went to war against the industrialists because they were working 10 and 12 hours a day plus Saturday. When the demand for the 8-hour wage came in a century ago. And of course now in the last 10 years, what was left of the labor movement got trashed, but they did it on the basis of, in my opinion, victim solicitation, because the entire AFL-CIO has been run by the CIA and the Mafia now for 50 damn years. And when you got people like that as your leadership, what do you expect them to do? I mean, in point of fact, if there is ever going to be a labor movement in this country, the working stiffs are going to have to go down to the international headquarters, line up all the international presidents, and just mow them down. Because the most absolutely deadly enemies of labor in the United States are the labor leaders. The fact that the AFL still exists at this time in history, funding reactionary and counter-revolutionary anti-union forces all over the planet, is to me a demonstration that the American working class deserves everything it gets. You know, why do you have sympathy for a chump who is willing to sacrifice the needs and interests of everybody else on the planet? Why should you feel sorry for that chump when he gets wasted by the same jerks? I'm sorry, I have a real hard time working up a lot of sympathy for somebody who's been sitting there for decades letting the CIA run operations all over the world, setting up death squads in Latin America to kill union organizers, etc. I just find that absolutely unconscionable. Any labor folks here that would disagree? I mean, I just find it absolutely beyond any possible justification. The basic game plan hasn't changed, I think, possibly since the first pharaoh in Egypt. I mean, there's some damn gun thug who wants to snooker the folks into fighting a war for his fun and profit. I mean, you know, what's new about that? I mean, it's hardly a novel proposition that some mobster wants somebody else to go out and die for him. What I never cease to marvel at is all these chumps who are willing to do it.
Under patriotism, it's amazing.
Is that what they call it, being a sucker?
Yeah, the workers on each side of the
Oh, you mean the bad still owner's tool with a worker at each end?
Yeah.
Well, in Kurt Vonnegut's latest novel, Hocus Pocus, he called Harvard plantation owners tech because...
He called which again? Harvard?
Harvard plantation owners tech because that's where the ruling elite goes to learn how to get everyone else to kill each other instead of them.
Oh, well, he and I have been thinking along the same lines then. Actually, there have been a lot of people noticing the same thing, and it was really interesting. Eisenhower said, you know, a long time ago, he said, someday people are going to finally realize that they have nothing to gain from any of these wars and none of these military budgets, and they're just going to make the leaders get out of the way and let them have peace.
Eisenhower said that?
Eisenhower said that. But does everybody remember that when he left office, the last speech he gave, his farewell address, is the one that warned everybody about the unwarranted power of the military-industrial complex. And he spelled it out in detail. And what is truly ironic is he was one of the people who helped create it.
Exactly.
And, you know, it's amazing, you know, when people get to a certain point in their life, they suddenly realize, oh dear, it is going to be shits for my grandkids. Maybe I screwed up. I spent my entire lifetime creating a system that I should not have done. And so then they do a mea culpa at the end, and
Roosevelt didn't say that.
Well, Truman did that about the CIA, didn't he?
as a matter of fact, the guy who wrote the original national security legislation for the National Security Act is Clark Clifford.
He's in trouble.
Clark Clifford actually wrote the bulk of the National Security Act of 1947, and is now, of course, testifying that it was probably the dumbest thing he ever did. And Harry Truman, in fact, after he had instituted all of the watch lists and death squads and imperial interventions and purged the teaching community of the disloyal by demanding loyalty oaths, ended up saying, golly gee whiz, it sure was a shame there was Joe McCarthy. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how many people end up doing this sort of pious posturing after having set up these goddamn machines that tear the world apart.
Like Lee Atwater's another one.
Yeah, he's a classic example. I apologize for using Willie Horton. That was just not a right thing to do. Well, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Oh, God, what a scumbag. You know, so yeah, he did it. And I think that he was as insincere in his apology as he was in everything else in his life.
Well, he's on deathbed, so to speak.
Then why didn't he?
I thought he maybe was sincere when he did it. Why did?
I don't think he was capable of sincerity.
Well, why do you think he did? I think because my thinking is such when I accept something, I don't go beyond it. And I thought he was.
Well, I think it was the same reason that Alexander Hamilton said he fired in the air on purpose after Aaron Burr stuck a 56 caliber lead ball through his guts. Because it looked better for history to say that. I think that's the motive. It has nothing to do with...
He also has a tumor affecting his brain.
Pardon?
He also has a tumor affecting his brain.
Who's the tumor speaking?
Atwater.
Just like I thought he died. I thought he was in the ground.
He didn't speak after his death.
He had a religious experience.
Well, maybe it was the tumor speaking. Maybe we should have saved the tumor and let him go.
I know that. No, the tumor could have said a lot more, maybe.
Well, it's getting so bizarre out there, and it's getting so late in the game is the thing that bothers me. Back in the days that Alexander Hamilton was setting up the biggest ripoff in the history of the Republic on a per capita basis, you know, it wasn't really terribly important, you know, if somebody went to a duel with a trick pistol designed to assassinate the adversary. Let me run through that little story again so you'll know what a real scuzzball Hamilton was, because he is now being spoken of very highly by Bill Sapphire. And you can be sure if Bill Sapphire thinks well of somebody that you probably ought to suspect them. Does everybody know that the United States did not liberate the Philippines from the Spanish? The Filipinos liberated the Philippines from the Spanish, and then we liberated the Philippines from the Filipinos. Exactly like Grenada, or Hawaii, or Panama, or Cuba, or everything west of the original 13 states.
You know, another person like Mark Twain.
Yeah.
That book, Total Espionage, it's also written by Kurt Rice. That's in the downtown library.
It is.
Yeah, and that's I went down there a couple days ago to check and see if any of those other books were
And
there.
that is the one that is there? Or?
There's only one there.
And
one copy and only one of
the several books that he wrote. Which is better than I might have expected.
Yeah, I started reading it. I haven't checked it out now, but I should have it.
Well, is it important? Because I haven't seen it.
I think it's important.
When was it written?
1941.
Okay, so he was turning out books fairly rapidly then in that period, 41, 44.
I think that was the last book he wrote, The Nazis Go Underground.
Yeah, according to this listing it was. But what I find so damn interesting is there's so damn much information available if you happen to find it.
But finding it is the challenge, because if you go to conventional courses in political science, U.S. history, etc., it will be precisely this material you do not get. You will get, however, Hofstetler, Seymour, Martin Lipset, and the other people cited as the authorities.
Oh, no, even better. I took comparative politics in the spring, and we had to read Samuel P. Huntington.
Oh!
Yeah.
A man who also wrote a book called wasn't it The Danger of Democracy?
Well, he wasn't he an advisor for Brzezinski or something like that?
Well, I were both.
Democracy, wasn't it?
Pardon?
The Crisis of Democracy?
That may be correct. He, in fact, that was seeing that when I was talking about how COINTELPRO and MK Chaos came in the late 60s, there was a reason for it, and that is that the natives were getting truly restless in this country. And in 1968, the first 3 months of 1970, $3 billion in damage was done in the United States by bombings, which did get the attention of the government. 3 billion, with a B, billion, that is from the Senate Internal Security Committee report. If you'd like, I can show you a copy of the report. And they are citing a study by the Treasury Department. And in fact, that was a time when the National Bomb Data Center was created under the aegis of the LEAA and FBI. And that NBDT came, or NDC, came in precisely as a means of stifling the information on what was really going on in the country. Oh my God, I see a mission of mercy en route.
What was the year that the $3 billion was on it?
Well, it was 1968, the first 3 months of 1970, a total of 15 months. $3 billion damage in 15 months, I think, is probably worth talking about as a matter of historical record, simply because that if you take the dollars of 1968 and bring them into 1991, you have just multiplied by 4. That's, in 1991 dollars, approximately $12 billion in damage.
Which would equal how many aircraft?
Well, let me put it this way: $12 billion in damage in the United States in, say 1991, first 3 months of 1992, would, if there were any real journalists and any honest reportage, qualify as news. Now I can...
How much of that stuff is reported at the time?
Oh, as a matter of fact, there was a great deal of reportage at the time. If you go back and look at Time, News and World Report, up to 1972. Now,
we were explaining what you had said.
Oh.
I assume, like, where were the bombings done?
Oh.
I'm assuming the entire United States.
well, I should bring in a map that I have of the bombings in the United States at that period, because in fact it is throughout the entire United States, with concentrations in areas of major population centers. I mean, the Bay Area, the number of bombings in the Bay Area as contrasted, say, with Stockton, or the Portland Metroplex compared, say, with Ontario. But in fact, there were bombings in places like Stockton and Ontario, i.e. draft board offices were burned down.
About Eugene.
Well, Eugene still has bombs going off in the last 6 months. So, I mean, not everybody's forgotten how to do things. And in fact, you have to stop and think about it. In that period, in the late 60s, early 70s, what happened in 1972, because I happened to have a home across the street from the parents of a guy by the name of Van Amberg, who was an anchor on one of the major TV channels in San Francisco. And he was visiting his parents one weekend, and I had a chance to chat with him, and he told me that there had been a meeting by all the news directors and executives for all the TV channels in the Bay Area, and they had agreed that they were going to censor any and all news either by, from, or about revolutionary organizations in the Bay Area. And I said, well, doesn't that qualify as censorship of the press? And he simply said, the only way we can put a stop to this is, in fact, to take it out of the news. Because, in fact, if it's in the news, it's going to encourage not only the people who are doing it because they want the attention, but it's also going to give ideas to other people. So, in fact, it was a strategic decision on the part of the quote-unquote fourth estate, which isn't the fourth estate. It is simply an integral part of the functioning of the elite system to, in fact, deliberately suppress information in the cause of perpetuating the elite. Of which, please remember, if you're making $3 million a year, you're part of that elite.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that Dan Rather would get on the air and say, yeah, I think capital gains tax is a really a wonderful idea if you're making $3 million a year like I am, because I need it. Now, if Dan Rather were to do that, I'd all of a sudden have an opinion of Dan Rather that would have to do a U-turn. Because Dan Rather will not do that. Dan Rather, in fact, is officially, on the basis of ethics, disqualified from holding the position he holds, precisely because what he is nominally reporting on, he has a material interest in. He is a party to and a partisan of precisely what he purports to report. Therefore, in fact, he has a conflict of interest. He cannot report real news honestly and truthfully on a disinterested basis because, in fact, he is part of what he's reporting. And that is the fundamental problem with the entire system of the distribution of information, whether it be the quote-unquote media or the education system. The education system will not recommend that you find Kurt Riess's book, The Nazis Go Underground, and then you will wonder why in the hell it is that we're all amazed in 1991 that there are Nazis running all over the Western world. I mean, you know, how come it comes as a big surprise? I mean, you have a book like Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyam that came out in 1980 that rediscovered what is already here in a book published in 1944. No, not plagiarism, reinventing the wheel. And if every generation has to reinvent the wheel, there is no net learning.
What the media
But if the society degenerates to the point where the only thing that counts is who can outshoot whom, what is that normally called? That's normally called a civil war. Right?
Yeah.
Well, we had a civil war when we were at one time under the British. You know, I mean, literally, the 13 colonies were part of Great Britain, and there was a little thing called a civil war, only we call it a revolution, or a war for independence, but it was essentially a civil war because it did, in fact, pit members of the same family against each other. In fact, if you want to know why Canada is so devoutly Tory to this day, it's because of all the people who fled the American Revolution and went north, just like the Cubans did. And for the same reason. Because property was expropriated, all sorts of things bad happened. I mean, they abolished 240 capital crimes, which now, of course, Bill Clinton is trying to reinvent.
What did you mean about just like the Cubans did? The Cubans.
Well, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cubans came to the United States. They fled to the north.
It's just like Australia was a penal colony.
Sure. You want to really insult Australia and ask if you get any, marks on his ankle from the chains. No? No, I'm serious. If you want to really insult Australia, remind the Australian of the fact that Australia was a penal colony.
And what about all the Cubans they sent over here that were the felons, convicted felons and everything?
Gee, that was rescuing people from the horrors of communism, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, they've been locked up in prison about...
ever since they got here, for 10 years.
Now there's been an agreement where they're shipping them back at a time or something.
Did anybody see the POV the other night here? Are these Cubans who've been in prison? One guy said he'd been in prison for 10 years for a $49 robbery, which he had committed unarmed because he was desperate, because he had no food, he had no place to live, and he hardly spoke the English language, and he could get no support from any part of the United States government or Florida government.
So we supported him.
Yeah, for 10 years. In fact, it would have been cheaper if we'd have sent him to Harvard, but...
Well, if he had done it here in Portland, he'd be dead.
Pardon?
If he'd done it here in Portland, he'd be dead, right?
Possibly, yeah, it could have been a capital offense. But, so they shipped him back to Cuba, and he gets there, he gets off, you know, they take the handcuffs off, you know, and pretty soon, here he is, hugging his mother, you know, and the Cubans didn't, you know, put him in jail. I mean, the Cubans have enough brains to realize that putting everybody in jail is kind of expensive. And so they don't tend to do that. The United States right now has close to 1 million people in prison.
Job program.
Could you explain your comment about Bill Clinton taking away the property crime laws? What exactly was your intent there?
Repeat that. He did what?
You said when the Cubans come up here in '59 and they fled north and they...
Oh, well, they were fleeing a revolution.
Well, yeah.
When we had our revolution in 1776, a higher percentage of the people in what was then the United States fled to Canada than fled to the United States from Cuba in 1959.
Yeah, but you said that they disbanded some of the property laws.
Oh, well, look, the People's Republic, of the United States in the period 1776 to 1787, we expropriated vast amounts of holdings from people like Lord Baltimore of Maryland, who had an estate of 100 by 300 miles given to him by the king. And the people of Maryland said, you know, to you, you know, the king's opinion's irrelevant, and so is your land title. And so they took it. In the case of, you know, the Governor Hutchinson of Boston, it didn't even take the revolution for the Patriots to trash his place. They went through his house in a way that would be the envy of the most enthusiastic gangbanger of 1993. I mean, if you think our founding fathers were a bunch of guys who sat around, you know, in knee pants and wigs discussing Plato and Aristotle, that's not entirely accurate. In fact, there's a wonderful book called The Alcoholic Republic, an American Tradition. Back in 1776, you could define a lot of people by how many quarts they could hold without sliding under the table. In fact, you would not want to have sat down in a drinking contest with George Washington or Tom Jefferson or any of those guys, because they would put you under the table, believe me. The amount of booze they could put away and still navigate out to the horse and you know, snooze it off on the way home would absolutely amaze you. But we have all these kind of silly ideas about our history that are just silly.